This episode is brought to you by Confluence. Confluence is a professional consulting firm comprised of landscape architects, urban designers, and planners. Our staff of 70 plus includes 39 licensed landscape architects and AICP certified planners, and our firm is comprised of energetic, creative, and passionate people who are involved in making our communities better places to live. We assist our clients on a wide range of public, educational, institutional, and private sector projects. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Jeff Space, a senior planner with Lamp Rainierson. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Our guests today are Susan Hansen and Genevieve Giuliano, authors of Geography of Urban Transportation. Susan Hansen is an urban geographer, now retired from Clark University, with interests in gender and economy, transportation, local labor markets, and sustainability. Her research has examined the relationship between the urban built environment and people's everyday mobility within cities. Within this context, questions of access to opportunity and how gender affects access have been paramount. Genevieve Giuliano holds the Margaret and John Ferraro Chair in Effective Local Government at the Sol Price School of Public Policy. She is the director of the MetTrans Consortium, a multi-university transportation research center. Her research spans many areas of transportation planning, including transportation and land use, transportation policy, travel behavior, and urban freight. Thank you for joining us today, Susan and Genevieve. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this book together?
I think I should start off on that because this is the fourth edition. And I did the first two editions without Jen. I think one of the questions you wanted to ask us was something about what do you think the listeners should know about your book. And I think one of the interesting things about the book is how it did start out as a first edition of the Geography of Urban Transportation, because it did not start out as a planning book. It started out as a geography book. I'm a geographer, and I was approached by the geography editor at Guilford, probably about 1982. She asked me, how about doing a book on urban transportation? I agreed to it and put together the book the way it is in the first edition, which came out in 84. And really, the whole idea behind that book and much of that first edition has been retained throughout all four editions, and much has changed too. And a large part thanks to Jen, and changed in a very good way, I think. But the book really started out, to show students and to help students understand how transportation is so fundamental and so central to understanding what goes on in cities. So you can't understand urban life or how cities function without understanding the role of transportation. And that was the original goal. And it was also, as you can see, if you go back to those first few editions, very much based around a framework of understanding place, space, context, analytical, and the role of geographic scale in the way in which you conceive a problem and analyze it and think about how to address it. So these are fundamental principles in geography. I think they're also fundamental in planning, and geography and planning share many, many similarities, as you know. But it really did start out as a geography book. And then I became very surprised and interested that it was really being used more in planning courses than in geography courses. That's how it started. And the first two editions I did. And then I asked Jen if she would come in on the third edition, because we had worked together on the first two editions in that she had written one of the key chapters, the one on land use impacts of transportation investments. And we had worked together in other contexts too. We worked together well, and I knew that she would really be fundamentally fantastic, which she is. So that's the history.
I guess I might jump to one of my later questions, since you touched on this a little bit, is what's changed? Because the fourth edition came out several years ago, and We've seen how technology and how rapidly changing technology is impacting transportation and how cities are growing. So I'm curious if there's anything that you've seen in the last several years since this fourth edition that's come out that you didn't touch on in the book or didn't expect.
Well, I'll take the first crack at that one because my kind of pithy little comment when I went through the questions was that's why we have four editions, because the field is changing all the time and transportation is changing all the time. You know, every single one of these editions is different. It's got some commonalities, but every single one is different. That's a response to what's changing in the real world. We are at a point where technology is changing very rapidly, more rapidly than ever before. And, you know, the kind of idea of a transportation revolution, I think, is kind of finally getting here. So I could see, you know, the next people who decide to do this book will spend even more time on technology than we did, because that'll be a very big theme. But there's also other big themes that we have in the book, but I think would be more emphasized today, namely equity and sustainability.
One of the themes that permeates all three volumes is the importance of evidence and evidence-based policymaking. In that regard, there's been some really interesting changes in the nature of data that's brought to bear on solving transportation-related questions. Just the widespread advent of smartphones, the use of smartphone data to track individual behavior, big data, the way in which people use smartphones while they're traveling and how that affects their travel patterns, e-commerce, e-health. I mean, I think public health has become a very noticeable and important issue, and the way in which transportation and public health intersect, and also just health in general, intersect, has become very clear throughout the pandemic. Of course, would we be so comfortable on Zoom now if the technology had not been shoved to the fore a couple of years ago? And just what we're doing here. This is a technological change since our book was published, really the global sharing of ideas and of best practices. That is done much more routinely now, I think, through things like your podcasts and webinars and so on. So I think that's our response to the technology question.
You talk about land use and transportation, the coordination of those two kind of investments and policies and planning. In many communities, the larger metros, they have a public transportation system. Transit-oriented development is often a key component of connecting land use and transportation planning, and to sustainably grow a community and absorb kind of population growth. In many of these communities, though, where there's now a renewed interest in development, these are communities that have had traditionally significant amount of disinvestment for generations, and now there's new investment coming in. So sometimes that can lead to displacement of the communities of people that have endured disinvestment. So how have you seen, how do transportation decisions, how do they get made in a way that can lead to better kind of racial and economic integration to provide some stability to those long-term residents?
This is a long-running problem. We've seen historically displacement of disadvantaged populations over and over again. That was the urban renewal policies of the 1960s, freeway building policies in the 1970s. I mean, this is the historically very long-running problem. And it's a problem that goes way beyond transportation. So one of the things that at least some of my colleagues have been doing a lot of work on recently is kind of looking at the historical legacy of redlining. If you look at cities today and you sort of overlay the redlining map on what the distribution of population is today, you will see that, those very same enclaves that were off limits 50 years ago are still suffering from those very same influences. So it's often the case that urban planners think of transit-oriented development as an economic development tool. Not simply for more sustainable cities, but for redevelopment and revitalization of different areas of the city. And if we do that, and we sort of let market forces move the way they will move, then if we invest and we generate more value, that's going to be reflected in higher land values, and that's going to be reflected in higher rents, and off you go to gentrification and the displacement of populations that are lower income and cannot pay the rents. So without any public intervention, that's exactly what happens. And so the public interventions that I see are sort of more on the planning side, because it's zoning, it's affordable housing requirements, it's policies that retain affordable housing in the marketplace. It's policies that call for some form of restitution. So if we're going to be developing in one place and displacing people, then we need to provide at least the same quality somewhere else. So it's all these other, I think, kind of ancillary policies that need to be in place if we are going to address this very long-running process that we see in American cities.
I can just agree. I was in grad school in the 1960s, and we were dealing with the same issues then. There was a very interesting book that was published, I think in 67 or something like that. Do the poor pay more? This guy studied people's access to food and showed that people in the communities that Jen was just describing did not have access to fresh food to the extent that other people did, and when they did, they paid more for worse quality. Anyway, these are very, very long-lasting problems. And other studies have been very discouraging in the sense that in other countries, for example, planners have intentionally designed communities that are multi-ethnic, multi-income, and so on. And after some years, people self-sort into much more homogeneous enclaves. So other than giving everyone a brain transplant that would encourage them to feel more comfortable with people who are different from themselves, I don't know. I mean, many people do feel fine and comfortable with people who are different, but others don't. And that's one of the factors underlying the current patterns that we see, which are of very long standing. It's the redlined communities from the 50s, 60s, and through the 70s are the same ones that don't have very many trees now. I mean, you can look at any measure you want, and that has been an extremely enduring process that was set in place with the redlining and so on that went on in the provision of home loans.
You mentioned redlining, and you can see, like you said, that you look at the maps of where these areas that were, rated as D at the time, and then comparing what's happening in those communities now. These are often the same communities that have federal, like HUD choice neighborhood grants in them today. 60 years later, really nothing has really changed. And one thing that was attempting to get at this under the Obama administration, during the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule and the fair housing assessment. And during that time, communities that were working on that fair housing assessment had to look at those contributing factors to accessing affordable housing. And transportation and access to employment was one of the key factors. And that's, for a lot of communities, we're really seeing again in plain sight that spatial mismatch between where affordable housing is located and where employment centers are being cited. And there's that mismatch. That shouldn't have been maybe a new revelation for many communities, but it was. So what are some of the downfalls that have caused that kind of missing connection between housing and job location?
The notion that it's just one job per household, and therefore you're trying to locate this household next to this job to minimize the commute or something, doesn't work because this household is going to have more than one worker, and they're not going to be commuting to the same place, most likely. Women's jobs are very different from men's jobs. There's still occupational segregation in the labor market by gender, by race, and so on. And also the whole idea about data on job openings being more valuable than employment. Yes, that may be true, but job openings are much more ephemeral than employment data. How timely are they? How useful are they for analysis? Those are big questions, and I'm not aware of work that has really solved the problem. How are planners going to get instant access to job openings? Right now, there are many job openings everywhere from what I can see and hear. So in one respect, it's a data issue. If you don't have the data, how are you going to address the problem? My bias, and I will state it up front, is toward addressing problems from multiple standpoints, addressing housing issues by providing very mixed neighborhoods, mixing single-family, multifamily dwelling units, mixed age, mixed ethnicities, and so on. So if you have mixed housing and multimodal transportation infrastructures, you will be a long way toward, and multimodal including pedestrian, bike, transit, of course the auto, because right now we can't live without the auto, and different forms of transit. If you have mixed housing and mixed multimodal approaches, you have a better chance of meeting the needs of a diverse population in a particular neighborhood. A lot of countries have had great success in making safe pedestrian and especially biking facilities. If you provide safe biking facilities, people will use them because it's the easiest way to get from here to there. It's the fastest in many cases, and certainly the most pleasant for some people, and the cheapest. But this has not been a priority in the U.S.
Yeah, everywhere I've worked, it's been a struggle to get bike and ped infrastructure to the level that we're building out our roads for vehicles. Some areas are better with transit than others, but I think transit still is a challenge to get built in a way that's very useful. Our system here in Lincoln is great if you're living in certain areas, but our whole system goes to one point in our downtown and then goes out from there. So if you're trying to go somewhere that's not related to downtown, it's more of a challenge. So we're still very car centric to be able to get to most of our destinations.
Another part of this, speaking of, what would be in the next volume, is the technology piece, and that we don't necessarily have to think about transit as fixed route transit anymore. We've got all kinds of hybrids that are kind of popping up. We have an opportunity to rethink the whole concept of what public transit is or is not. And that kind of liberates you from the highly constrained, spatially and temporally highly constrained transit systems.
That's interesting. In the Omaha metro area, we have a bus system, but there's there's recently been an announcement of a streetcar. And what is usually shared about why they need streetcars is that this permanency of the rail is what will create more dense development, and that there's not this signal to the development community that there's stability if the routes can change, and therefore they're withholding investing into those corridors. But now with this potential streetcar, they've been announcing more dense development potential. So that's interesting that you say that, because that is different mindset and towards the future.
The argument about rail and permanence has also been around for a really long time, ever since the feds started heavily subsidizing capital investments in transit. So that goes back to the 1960s. One of the interesting things that I've done along the way in sort of my research is I had the opportunity to look into the Chicago transit system. Chicago has trains and buses and all kinds of things, right? It's a very rich system. I had the opportunity to look at routes as they developed. Believe it or not, at that time, CTA had in paper form a file of all of its routes, starting from the late 19th century. So in 1886, horse car line XYZ was put into service on these roads. And the transit lines, whether rail or bus, were pretty much the same almost a century later. So, the idea that only rail transit is permanent actually is not supported by the evidence, even though you hear it all the time. So you're right, thinking about, different sorts of ideas about transit, certainly different. But people and firms actually, in our society, where we give a lot of favor to market forces. We pretty much let locals decide what's going to happen in terms of their land use, right? Locals have authority. Most locals kind of move with the market, and what the markets have done is highly decentralize our metropolitan areas. So yes, it might help to, try to foster more density in, let's say, the downtown area, but the vast majority of the population doesn't live there. It lives elsewhere. And if we want to really look at how we reduce car VMT, then we have to be more imaginative about how we handle these areas that are not downtown.
It's sort of an interesting thought, the way in transportation solutions and issues, they don't stop at jurisdictional boundaries. It is a regional issue. The needs and the solutions they might be unique to each community, yet there's still enough sort of movement and patterns of movement that cross those boundary lines between people, whether that's for work or leisure or where they live. So thinking more about transportation solutions across those boundaries, when you're dealing with each local district's funding mechanisms and their own policy goals and vision for their community, do you have ideas or examples of regional collaboration to help fund transportation systems or solutions that are unique to each community?
So it's a regional solution that meets the needs of communities within the region. Probably diverse communities within the region. Well, I'm here in Vermont, and we only have one city.
There's sort of the classic example that you guys know about, and that's Portland, where Portland's regional planning authority has more authority than most. Where the state has actually allowed for land use control at the regional level. And so there's actually been more kind of region level coordinated planning in Portland than there has in other cities. But though, it's an exception to the rule. It's not the rule, it's the exception to the rule. The other example that comes to mind is Minneapolis, St. Paul. It became very famous for its regional revenue sharing back in the 1990s, where a portion of the property and other taxes were actually put into a regional fund in order to essentially cross-subsidize low-income communities. And that was hailed as, a great model. There were books written about it, et cetera, as, a first attempt at trying to sort of equalize the resources within a community, within different communities in a region. Over the years, it has never, the idea was to start small and create bigger. Over the years, it was never made any bigger, and there have been sort of constant efforts to push back, and nor has any other metropolitan area adopted this policy. So we see some lovely outlier examples, but for the most part, I'm going to say that regional policy is really brokered. Regional planning policy, transportation planning policy is brokered among the stakeholders. It has to be, to some extent, consensus based, and it's a matter of trading off. So I'll let you use my local sales tax for this as long as I get that in return. And so it's mostly kind of a bargaining process, that leads to compromises and not necessarily consistent policies across the region, although it's a step in the right direction. The other thing that, my longtime colleague, Marty Wax, would have told you is that we're seeing this tremendous fragmentation of funding sources. We're seeing more and more sources being locally generated, funding sources being locally generated. And the more that happens, the more empowered localities become. The funding piece, the financing piece, is actually working against region level planning in transportation.
Just to tack on to what you said, Jen, there's a fascinating article in the New York Times today about Portland, Oregon, and the debate that's raging there right now about how to allocate the funds from the federal government, the Biden Build Back Better funds, and whether they should be used to expand the highways there, which runs against the adopted and publicly agreed upon policy to reduce greenhouse gases, or to use the funds to expand bicycle and pedestrian facilities to make biking and walking safer. It really speaks to the politics that are behind any kind of decision about, and in this case, it's, quote, free money to the region. So it's not coming out of anyone's immediate local pocket, but it's a very contentious issue, and there's no resolution yet. So we have to stay tuned. No doubt it'll be divvied up somehow, but and the highways will get something. And it's interesting because the main divide, at least as it was portrayed in this piece, was between young people who are very much opposed to having any more money for highways, and the, quote, establishment who are running the show and basically looking at the highways and saying, well, we need more because the congestion is so bad.
Yeah, Portland has a much higher level of congestion than any other city of its size.
And it also has a higher rate of bicycle use than any other city of its size.
Is it Portland, or is Portland at the top?
I think it's
up there.
That's interesting because Portland, that was a decision, a series of decisions in the early 70s that you see all the benefits, continually throughout the decades, but in whether it's planning schools or, new planners hear stories of places like Minneapolis or Portland, mostly Portland, and many planners, though, may not be working in communities like Portland. They are in places that are maybe just beginning those kind of conversations about a long-term vision for multimodal transportation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Like, what recommendations do you have for planners that work in regions that are just beginning, or maybe it hasn't even started yet? Where would a planner begin to try to spark some of these conversations about these regional transportation issues?
You want to go back to evidence, Susan?
It would astonish me if there are communities that haven't started these conversations, because one of the Zooms I've been on in the last couple of days is all about the Sustainable Development Goals, which most people have heard about, especially if you're in the planning field. And the whole issue of sustainability is so fundamental to most conversations. If you're thinking about the future, which is what planners do, how do we get somewhere, wherever the there is going to be? How do we get there from here? So I would hope that people have, I'm not answering your question because I just can't believe, I don't want to believe that people haven't started thinking about these things. But the first thing you can think about is get off the highway focus and think about multimodal approaches. Number one. First of all, one reason transportation is so fascinating to me is because it intersects with just about everything else. So when you say transportation, what are the transportation solutions to X, Y, or Z? There is no simple transportation solution. It intersects with all kinds of other policy arenas, housing, employment, health, and so on. And it has to involve local communities. It has to involve local communities and hear from local communities about what their priorities are. I mean, here we are talking about disadvantaged communities and how can we help them? What are some solutions they would suggest? I mean, this goes back to the 1970s when we had, and 60s, when there was a lot of attention. It was like a eureka moment to planners. Oh, there are people in the communities that we are planning for that should actually have a say in the whole process and what the goals are and how we should proceed and what the process should be. We need to remember this. We need to engage local communities because they will see the whole ball of wax. They will see all the different angles. And we need to hear from all the different sub-communities who will be affected by any transportation decision making. But I would say you're going to start somewhere. Just stop thinking about highways and cars as the only mode of transportation. There was just an article in the latest TRB, the Transportation Research Board magazine they send out every month or whatever. And it was about how to plan intersections so that pedestrians and cyclists can actually maneuver them because they've been planned only with a car in mind. So let's think multimodally, first of all, when you plan anything. That'll be my little rant for today.
I have a kind of a less lofty answer, which is that there's always low-hanging fruit wherever you are. And there's nothing, as far as I can tell in my experience, there's nothing that is better than demonstrating. In a community that's at the beginnings of any of this stuff, there's always resistance because it's something different. And it's always easier to say, let's try a demo somewhere, or so let's just do this bike intersection stuff in a couple of intersections and see how it goes. And most of the time that's what gives you the entree, because once people experience these things and you see that people are actually happy to be able to ride their bikes more safely and things like that, and are able to walk on sidewalks more safely, then you start to get buy-in. So it's kind of a more practical kind of thing, but that seems like that often works. I've seen that happen in many places with many different applications of many different things.
Yeah, that's a really important approach. And I think back to the early 1970s when cities started experimenting with having car-free zones in the downtown. And there was a huge outcry against this. This will never work. People won't come. Merchants were up in arms because their customers would fall away. They couldn't walk 3 steps to get there. And a few demonstrations showed when people actually tried it, they were hugely successful.
Yeah, that's happening in the Omaha Metro under a planning initiative called Metro Smart Cities. They put together a pilot project for a protected bike lane last year, and it's about a 2-mile stretch. And they've seen winter and through summertime, the ridership is up 140%, like double than what they actually thought it might be. And proving that case. Like people are out there saying, I typically wouldn't have been riding on this stretch, but it feels safe and I can get to where I need to go. It's relatively flat. Yeah. And now the question is, well, where do we expand this to? Not necessarily let's take it out. Let's keep building on it. So yeah, your point is really being applied here in the Omaha area right now.
So, I mean, that's the thing. If you have a 2-mile bikeway, if you build it out to 20 miles of trail, it's going to be your ridership is going to increase way more than 100. You said 120% or something. It's really going to explode because people need to be able to go where they want to go. And One thing that always bothered me about the way people think about cycling, or the way a lot of transportation planners think about cycling, is it's either utilitarian or recreational. No, people want to go somewhere and they want to go by bike. That can be recreational and utilitarian. And to have bikeways that just end, that is a disaster. You have to build a whole system because you don't want to be shoved out onto a major highway when you're biking along cheerfully on a dedicated bikeway. Anyway, I said I would only do one rant, but I've done more than that.
You should all know that Susan is an avid bike rider.
Hey, Jen, guess what? We got electric bikes last summer. This was a big move, and they're fantastic.
Are they? I got a bike for the first time a year ago.
Well, good. I'm proud of you.
Yeah.
You like it?
I do. I do not like riding on the roads, however.
Not out there, Jen. Don't do it.
No, I do. I only go on roads where there's no traffic.
Good.
But, point taken of our conversation.
I used to live in Omaha, which is really hilly, and I just despised my commute to the office every day because there was like 4 massive hills. The bikeway that Jeff was mentioning there's a few major hills on it. And I just kind of toughed through it. And I was very close to buying an e-bike just to help with getting through the hills, but moved to Lincoln and it's flat as a pancake and it's didn't have to go and get the e-bike.
Well, that's what the e-bike is great for. It's for the hills. And otherwise you just ride it.
The bike share system in Omaha, they introduced e-bikes a few years ago, just at 1 or 2 at each station. And now it's the entire system. The fleet is electric, almost the entire fleet. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing to also think about someone can be a, cyclist and never own a bike. They could that could be a clear identity that they have and move around the entire, most of the city, most of their day-to-day trips and never own a bike. Like that is just a totally different way of thinking.
Yeah. And the same with cars.
Well, we're getting close to our hour, so I'll wrap it up with a question that you actually started to answer at the very beginning of the episode, and that's, what would you say is the most important thing that listeners of this episode or readers of your book should take away?
The first thing, and I'll admit that this is how I teach the course, even today, is that we really need to understand how and why people make the travel choices that they do. And that's all about our needs, our resources, our alternatives, our preferences, all kinds of things. And I think that that's just really, really important to understand. The second thing that's really important to understand is the role that public policy plays in those choices that we make. So it's actually not an accident, that most people depend on the automobile. It's not because Americans love automobiles any more than anybody else. It's because we created a system that makes automobiles by far the most convenient and cheapest form of travel. Those are public policy decisions. They're not anything more than that. The fact that we had this long conversation about bicycling just now, that's because as public policy, we've not invested in bicycling at the levels that we've invested in other things. By public policy, we have very cheap fuel taxes. The cheapest fuel taxes among all of the high income nations in the world. That's a policy decision. So I could go on, right? But the point is that all of these things that we do as part of planning and public policy are, in fact, the resources and constraints that people have regarding their travel behavior. So those are kind of the 2 things that I would say are at the top of my list.
Given that you've covered the policy issue, Jen, I will just say that one thing I hope students and people will take away from our book is how central transportation is to understanding the world, because it intersects with almost every other major policy arena that policymakers and decision makers worry about. it very much, as Jen just said, basically, it very much structures the communities that we live in, and trying to change the situation, which is actually what those many communities are trying to do now, to make communities that are more livable and that offer more alternatives to the automobile. These attempts to create change have to be made against a backdrop of the legacy of policy decisions that Jen just described. And it's not just a matter of tweaking transportation. It's a matter of involving policymakers from many other different realms to create a new living environment or different living environments for people that are more interesting and more enjoyable and offer more alternatives. If you don't want to live in a single family house in a distant suburb, what about living in a multi-ethnic community in a multi-family house on a bicycle way with a park next door in a semi-dense area? There's just lots of different alternatives, and it will be good to be able to design some of these, but to transform some environments so that there are more choices available.
Yeah, I think I want to go back to one of the things you said at the very beginning, Susan, which was about evidence and evidence-based research. We made a big effort in the book and in, selecting authors, et cetera, to create an evidence-based case in every single chapter. And I hope that that's what students take away, especially. You really have to do your homework to understand how things work. And it's very easy to sort of rely on generalizations or on limited evidence. We see that all the time, but that doesn't help you to truly understand. And if you don't truly understand what you're advocating, is unlikely to be successful. So I think that's another piece of the book that we both hope that it gets across for the readers.
I think that's a great thought to end on for this episode. Genevieve and Susan, I just want to thank you so much for joining us to talk about your book, The Geography of Urban Transportation.
Thank you. It was fun.
Well, thank you.